This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Stephanie Stollar. I am the founder of the Reading Science Academy and a part-time assistant professor at Mount St. Joseph University in the online reading science program. And oh, I see where my link to the handout pasted right here in the middle of the first slide. So I apologize for that. I am happy to be here talking with you all. I have great fondness for the state of Michigan for many reasons that I won't go into, but also great respect for all of you who have started this chapter of the Reading League in Michigan, my neighbor to the north, since I'm here in Ohio. So thank you for asking me to be with you today and talk a little bit about reading research. So as educators, you are called on to make 1,000 different decisions every day, especially those of you who are directly teaching in the classroom. And your decisions in the classroom are guided by a variety of different influences. Obviously, your beliefs about how reading develops or what can go wrong or what to do when something goes wrong, your experience, what's worked for you in the past, what you've seen other people do that has been effective or not effective, what you've been told to do, maybe by a coach, by an administrator, even by people you trust, telling you what to do. We also are sometimes guided by what we like, our preferences, what we would prefer to be doing in the classroom. And somewhere on that list is research. And I think there's actually a great deal that can be helpful and useful to classroom teachers in the reading research. So if you haven't, probably all of you have already gone to whatisthescienceofreading.org and signed on to the national definition and joined that conversation. You've probably been discussing this as a Reading League chapter. The definition itself, I think, helps us to understand that the science of reading is not a program, it's not an approach, it's not a fad, it's not a thing. It is a vast body of evidence and research that can be helpful in making decisions about what to do in the classroom. And part of that definition is this phrase, scientifically based research. I think this is worth clarifying because there are different research methods that are used in education and even in the area of reading. And not all of those would qualify to meet the definition of scientifically based research. So the kind of research that I'm talking about here that we're going to be looking at reading in an educational journal are the research studies that are empirical, that have a quantitative methodology where variables are controlled and manipulated and measured so that we can make causal statements about student performance, about teacher performance, about the outcomes that we're seeing. So I just wanted to draw a contrast between the types of research that you'll see in education and what I'm going to be specifically focusing on and talking about, and what we mean when we say the science of reading. So here are some of the characteristics of those quantitative research methods, where you're going to see control over the circumstances, where you're going to see the opportunity to design an experiment ahead of time, where the results, the procedures and results can hopefully be replicated. That's how we develop a body of evidence over time, by seeing studies that are replicated and then being able to draw conclusions across a variety of different studies. And the contrast then is with qualitative research, which the characteristics you can see here, the design and procedures may evolve over time. It's much more naturalistic, less controls over the variables that are at play in the research, more along the lines of capturing in a naturalistic way what's actually happening, what people believe or think, perhaps making correlations between variables, but not controlling the environment so that you can make causal statements about variables that are in the study. So I think this sort of side by side helps to make the point that both types of research methods are valid, are useful and helpful and important when it comes to reading research, but the quantitative studies are the ones that help us to understand the causes and the effectiveness, putting approach A versus approach B, which one works best. That kind of question is where we need a quantitative method to the research. So those are the kinds of research studies that I'm going to be sharing with you, helping you to untangle and be able to digest. So I want to just pause and see if there are thoughts or questions so far. And I don't have the chat open, so I'm just going to encourage you to unmute and ask a question if you have one.
I'm just wondering if, as we move forward, if you will be addressing that sometimes the practitioners tend to value qualitative more than quantitative because of some of the fear, their own belief systems behind that, as you stated earlier, and how we might address that.
I wasn't planning to explore that more, so tell me what you're thinking about practitioner beliefs.
Because
you mean from their
we often hear
program.
Right. Well, we tend to hear from the field, yes, but in my experience, right, their qualitative experience, that they tend to discount quantitative research as a researcher in a controlled environment. So I'm just wondering how we might answer that. So
yeah, that's certainly a factor. That I think comes from your training program. In my experience, that's a preference or a message that teachers get, that you should trust your gut, that you should go with the art of teaching, that that other kinds of research are too sterile or too controlling or interfere with children's natural development, or those kinds of messages. And I think that comes from some of the professors in teacher training programs who have that preference themselves. That's where that message, I think, comes from, or it can come from. So what I'm hoping to convey is that there's a place for both types of research, that the methodology that you use in a study really needs to match the research question that you have. And so the kinds of questions that we're talking about when we say the science of reading simply are questions that can't be answered. Oh, I've got a typo on my slide. Nobody pointed out my typo. Oh, okay, I have to fix this. Sorry. We can pause the recording or repair this later. Sorry about that. The kinds of questions that we're trying to answer within the science of reading are questions that can't be answered with qualitative research methods. They can only be answered with quantitative research methods. So these kinds of questions about how variables are related, about how the reading processes develop, about how instructional methods work or don't work, which ones work better. So that also is related to sort of a cycle of what happens in educational research. So it starts with a question that somebody has, and often those questions come from schools and from teachers. They are often explored initially with qualitative methodology. So we're just gathering information initially about that question through interviews, through observation, through journals, through surveys, for example. And then theories develop, and as those theories advance, then there might be a shift sometimes into more quantitative methods. Those findings get published, those studies get replicated, those findings are implemented in schools, and then eventually the practice may become commonplace. So I'm thinking about something like what we know in terms of phonemic awareness and its contribution to reading, how it is related to and predictive of decoding skills, fluency skills, reading comprehension, that we're, somewhere down the line here in terms of the cycle of research with a skill like that. But there still is quite a gap between what's happening in research and what's happening in schools. And part of that is a barrier that's set up in teacher training that doesn't prepare teachers well to understand research methodology, to understand how to read a research article in a journal, which is our topic for tonight. So, I've really wrestled with this question, should educators be expected to read research? Is this a realistic, reasonable expectation that we should put on teachers? And I go back and forth. I'm somewhat of two minds about this, I guess. But ultimately, I'm going to say that, yes, this is an expectation, but not in a vacuum and not with our current state of being, because teachers are not prepared for this understanding in their training programs. Administrators are not prepared. Other educators working in schools don't have the background knowledge to be able to be real consumers of research. They don't have the expectation that they will be, and school systems aren't set up to support them in that. So there are several things I think that would need to change to make that a reality, to make it an expectation that I would even feel comfortable putting on teachers. As it is right now, it's a big leap. So hopefully this presentation will help fill in some gaps for folks. So one of the first things I thought I would do is just kind of make a point about the fact that everything you see in print is not necessarily a research article. This is really important, I think, to recognize and be cautious about. People throw around phrases like research says, or I saw in so-and-so's research, and it can be difficult to understand what it is you're looking at sometimes. So I thought I would just give some examples of different types of publications and try to draw a distinction with what a journal article that is a research study published in a peer review journal would look like. So I'll start with an example of a blog. Most people are familiar with this type of writing. And in a blog, you might see reference to a research study, but the person writing the blog is not often doing research. With the exception of Mark Seidenberg, you're typically not going to see research in somebody's blog. This is more of an opinion piece. You will see in professional publications summary articles. So they are in print. They're not just available online, but they're in print publications. And these would get referenced and cited in other works, but this is not a research publication. So any statements that are made in a publication like this would not qualify as research. Sometimes those are opinion pieces like this one, where people are drawing on lots of research studies that they have read, perhaps that they've conducted themselves, and they are summarizing that and making statements. So here's an example from that article where Joe Torgerson is drawing his own conclusion, right? And you could reference that statement, if you quoted it in your blog or your own other type of writing, but this isn't a statement that comes from research. You're going to see lots of that in the compilation works like these, where people are doing summaries of research. Kilpatrick's Essentials book is an example of that. And so here is a quote from that book where he's referencing a string of different research studies, and he's giving his sort of statement or summary of what he has read in the research. But you wouldn't cite his book as being research. Does that make sense, that clarification? You will also see a type of publication that is a literature review. So here's an example by Susan Ebers and colleagues. So this is not a publication of a research study itself. It's a summary of lots of research studies. These are really helpful to read, but just again, trying to draw a distinction. And then you also will see in publication meta-analyses, which is a specific type of research analysis where they are drawing effects from multiple studies. So a meta-analysis is a particular type of publication. So let's focus in on the standard run-of-the-mill journal article and how you could approach reading one. I'm going to give you some indicators of quality, what you want to be looking for when you're reading a journal article. One thing you want to look for in high quality research itself is that the procedures have been described in enough detail that somebody else could replicate the study and get the same results. And when you see replication, that's really helpful, whether they got the same results or not, whether they used the same population or extended to a different population. This is where we can start to get sort of that preponderance of the evidence that we want to see so that it can guide our work in schools. So replication is really important. You also want to be aware of generalizability, how like your students are the students in the study, how similar was the school, how many students or teachers, whatever was being studied, were in the research. That's an indication of how generalizable the results will be. We'll talk a little bit more about that. You want to look for indicators that the procedures were actually implemented as planned. The technical term for that is either intervention fidelity or treatment integrity. And it's nice when you can see that that has been actually measured. So let's say there's a procedure to use a routine in classroom instruction, and the teacher is using that routine, and there's a researcher or somebody else observing that the steps of that routine were actually implemented. And when that's reported as part of the study, it gives a lot of confidence that the results were actually due to whatever those procedures were. You want to evaluate the assessments that were used in the research study, if they were what we call technically adequate, if they were reliable and valid, if those measures were ones that were created by the researchers just for this study, or if they are sort of widely known or even published assessments that have a long track record. That's going to increase your confidence in the results, that those assessments actually measured what they intend to measure. That's the validity piece. And that if you gave that same assessment again, if a different person gave the assessment, if it was given to the same student tomorrow, you would get the same result, that you've got that stability over time. That's the reliability piece. In experimental research, we're looking for the presence of comparison groups. So an experimental group who gets the new procedure or treatment, so to speak, and a control group, a group of students who are matched on important variables, but they are not receiving the procedure or treatment or intervention. And when students are randomly assigned to either the experimental or control group, that also increases the quality of the study, because you can be more confident that the changes that happened, if changes happen, were the result of the procedure and not just chance. Okay, I'm going to pause here and see if there are questions. Anybody watching? Rebecca, are you watching the chat? Any questions coming in that way? I can open it up.
Nope, we don't have any.
I have a comment, Stephanie, or basically a question. So if we're giving a professional development, say on orthographic mapping, and we bring in some of the work of Kilpatrick, would it be better to bring in instead of bringing in Kilpatrick, go right to those studies?
What do you mean by bringing in the content of your professional development, or you mean?
So invalidating what we are recommending.
Yeah, it would be best to go to the actual the original sources and studies. And I think that's where things get difficult and time consuming, right? So reading something like Kilpatrick's Essentials book gives you kind of the broad brushstrokes and his interpretation of the research, but it's really important to dig a little bit deeper into the original works that he's citing to see if you would come to the same conclusions that he does, to see if he is interpreting those results appropriately and accurately. You would have a much better leg to stand on if you take that step of not taking somebody's word for it, but actually reading the research that is cited in those compilations, reading it yourself. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
It is what I'm getting at, just because you do come up against that resistance in professional development where teachers will say something like, well, you can include point research in many directions. So I think if you went right to the source and you knew that source, I think it would give you more credibility.
Yes, definitely. So are you thinking the way that people say you can find research to prove anything, to back up anything? Yeah, which is actually not true.
I know.
You actually can't find research to prove any point or to back up any belief, even in education or even in reading.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But that's a common thing that they say. So I think I need an answer for that.
Yeah. Well, I didn't go into it in great detail, but my distinction between qualitative and quantitative research was sort of along the same lines that, the old Ken Goodman statement to Emily Hanford that, well, that's your research, right? So there are different types of research that address different questions that are designed for different questions. And so, yeah, I guess to go back to your original statement about designing professional development, it would be most accurate to go to the original studies and to have some sense of what's in that original work yourself. Sometimes I hear people say, not to harp on David Kilpatrick, but because he's got these books that are such helpful compilations, they'll say, well, Kilpatrick says, or Kilpatrick's research says, and I don't know of any research that Dave Kilpatrick has published. I know he has at least one unpublished study, but what they mean is research that David Kilpatrick has communicated, has shared, has summarized, right?
Yes.
That's what people mean, but it's really a misstatement.
And he's very good about mentioning Lene Airy and that she was the originator of that. And
yes, he's certainly not trying to claim anybody's work as his own. He's quite clear about that. But people hear it that way. You know, that's where
Yes.
they read it in Kilpatrick's book, so they'll talk about it as, or they heard it in his presentation, so they'll talk about it as his research. So that's just a caution and an awareness.
Can I lift that? I appreciate that question, Jana, and Dr. Stollar, your response, because I'm going to admit I'm guilty of the said Dr. Kilpatrick says, right? Knowing full well that the work of his predecessor and Dr. Linnea Airy, and add to that, I think part of the problem, and I will hope that our community can find an answer to the paywall issue. That's a whole other conversation. So it's difficult for those of us that are somewhere that bridging the researcher, the practice, and then there's some of us trying to bridge that work.
Yep.
The paywall is going to be a conundrum for quite some time.
Yeah, I've got some strategies about that at the end that I'll share.
Thank you.
But that's a major barrier to doing what I'm suggesting. Yeah. Okay, so on the left-hand side here, you can see the sections that will be apparent if you are looking at a publication that is an actual journal article that is summarizing research. Because regardless of which journal it's published in, you're going to see these sections. This is pretty standard. Actually, there's a style manual from the American Psychological Association that kind of dictates the way that research gets summarized and published, and it basically follows this sequence of headings. So if you're looking at a print publication or you're looking at a journal online, even I'm thinking of the Reading League Journal, you're not always necessarily seeing these headings throughout, and so that's a good sign that either it's an opinion piece, it's a compilation, it's maybe a literature review, but it's not a publication of a research study. I don't know if people have questions about the editorial review board process, what peer reviewed means. I'll just say that I hear people confuse that term. I think what people are used to when they hear the phrase peer review, they tend to think of like a review on Yelp or a review on Travelocity or something like that, where peers are reviewing each other, right? And that's not exactly the way that this phrase is used in publication of research. Journals, even the Reading League Journal, have an editorial board. They have an editor and a board of people who have expertise in a variety of different areas. And when somebody has a research study that they want to publish, they submit it to a journal. They actually will probably submit it to several journals because it's difficult to get published. And what happens is there are guidelines for each journal, and you should be able to see them right inside the front cover or on that journal's website that tell you how to make a submission and what the process will involve. And usually your paper, your research paper, will be reviewed by a group of professionals who have expertise in the area of your study or the methodology of your study, or both. And often it's 3 different people will read your paper, and they will make very detailed comments and suggestions and send those to the editor, and the editor will decide if the paper should be published, if it should be published as it is, if it should be published after making revisions, or if it's rejected. And then people will, if it's rejected, take it to a different journal and try again. And there are actually, I would say, there's a hierarchy of journals. There are some that will, that have, I guess, different criteria that make it easier to get something published in. So that's a little bit about the process. Are there questions about that when we say peer reviewed, what that means? Okay, so here's a little bit more information about those headings, the sections that you'll see in a journal article publication. Many people look at the title of the article first to see if it's related to a topic they're interested in, if they want to read the whole article. The listing of the authors, just so you know, is in order of their contribution to the research. So the first author is kind of the lead, the person who perhaps was the principal investigator on the study, and had a major contribution to writing up that article. The abstract will give you kind of the one paragraph summary of what happened, and those are what are often available free online and on, you know, the educator side of that paywall. You don't have to pay for them. So here's the heading of a recently published study. You can see the title can kind of draw you in. Sometimes they're provocative, but they at least tell you a little bit about what the study involved. You can see the authors there, and you can see the actual citation. So if you needed to cite this in your professional development or something that you're writing, that's the way that you want to do it. And there's usually in that citation a link to finding the study online, but that can be tricky, as we've noted, because many journals make their money from the either databases or the university libraries that have to pay an enormous amount of money to subscribe to them, and then they are not freely available to the public. So here's an example of an abstract. So you can see, you know, some sort of statements at the end about what happened during the study. This is something to be a little bit cautious about. I find that when you read the abstract, it's always very optimistic and very positive. And you want to dig a little bit deeper and make sure that that really is what was found, if you would have the same inclination about the findings. The next section of the journal article will be a review of the existing literature, the existing research prior to the study that is being written up. So this is where the authors should make a case for why their study was needed. What were the gaps in the reading research prior to this study being done, and how does this study contribute to what's known in the reading research? And it's, I think, really important and helpful when the authors will give a hypothesis about what they think is going to happen. Now, obviously, they've already conducted the study, so they're writing this perhaps retroactively, but there should be a statement about what they predicted was going to happen. It's just one way to cut down on a little bit of bias that might enter into the equation. The end of that review of the literature should give you really clear research questions. So this is what they set out to study. Usually there's 2 or 3. This is what they set out to study, and this is what you should track all the way through reading the rest of the journal article. Did they study these questions with appropriate research methods? Did they actually report the results related to these questions? And then what do they conclude about these questions at the end? So the next part of the journal article will be the methods. And this is where you're going to see a description about the participants. And there should be a fair amount of detail here. You should be able to see the number of participants, who they were, if it was teachers, if it was students, what the demographic variables are of the participants, what their characteristics were before the study, and how were they assigned to conditions. Was it random assignment who got the procedure, the intervention, the instructional approach, or did students or teachers self-select into that? That would cut down on your confidence in the results. And you should pay attention to where the research was done. Was it a school that's similar to yours demographically, geographically, in size, or was it done in the lab school at a university? under very controlled conditions, or was it done in a lab itself, not done in any kind of a school setting? So important to pay attention to that. The other parts of the methods describe the procedures that were used. Here's where you want to see a lot of detail about what the quote unquote approach to instruction was, or what the procedures were. You want to know who was delivering whatever the intervention or instruction was. How were they trained? Were they teachers? Were they reading interventionists, reading specialists, or were they researchers or graduate students, right? Because that would impact the generalizability of the findings. You want to see what the methods were. You want to learn a little bit about the reliability and validity of those measures. So here's an example from this same publication that I've been sharing with you, where you can see who the subjects were. Okay, so you saw in the abstract what the sort of conclusions were that the authors drew and stated in the abstract, but now here's the subjects. 6 typically developing kindergarten students who spoke English from middle-class backgrounds. 4 of the 6 were identified as white, non-Hispanic students. So right off the bat, knowing that it was a study with 6 kindergarten students, well, 6 students, right, is going to limit the generalizability. You can't make sweeping generalizations or run out and implement something that has been studied with only 6 people. Kindergarten students only, English speakers only, middle-class backgrounds, right? Does this generalize to your school, your students, your setting? How much of what they found can relate to your circumstances? That's what you want to be looking at there about the subjects. Here are some things to consider about the results that are reported. And this is where it's going to probably go beyond what I would expect most educators to have a solid understanding of, to be able to really determine if the statistical analyses, if the research design and methods were appropriate for the research questions, the number of participants, the level of analysis that was used. Those are things that I think are really beyond what I would at least expect most educators to be familiar with, and where you might want to go to somebody for some additional support. So here's the same article example that we've been following along, and a little bit about the design of that study. Here are the graphs that were included. This just happened to have been a single subject, multiple baseline design, so you can see the 2 students in each of 3 different groups and what their results look like over different conditions in the study. Usually you'll see tables or graphs of some sort in this section. And then you'll see the actual findings. So here's a paragraph about their first finding and their second finding. Sometimes people go straight to this section of a journal article. They want to just get to the meat of what was found, and this is where you'll find it. The last section of a journal article will be the discussion, and this is where you'll see some variability in what's included. Hopefully the authors are including a discussion of the limitations of their research. So this should bring into question the results, if there was anything irregular or just limiting, like having 6 kindergarten students be the focus of the study. This is where you'll also see the authors suggest future research, questions that are left unanswered as the result of their study, what could happen next, how to extend or replicate what they found. And then more and more, I think we're seeing a section called implications for practice. And this is what's really helpful for educators to be able to see how the researchers imagine that this could be implemented in schools and what the value might be for implementing in schools. So here's what the limitations section looked like. Here's what the implications for practice looked like in this particular publication. And the very last thing that you'll see at the end of a journal article are the references. These are usually several pages. They are in APA style. They are citing the original work that's mentioned in the literature review. They are citing evidence for the methods that were used in many cases, and giving you those primary sources if you are so inclined to go back and read that original work. So here is my list of suggestions of where you can go to find published reading research. One way around the paywall that exists between educators and the journal publishers is to ask the first author. On the title page, there's almost always a note at the bottom about how to contact the first author. And these days that includes the person's email address. And believe me, those people would love to send you a PDF of their research publication, because the researchers are often wondering, is anybody ever going to read this? You know, they have worked for years on the research and then years to get it published. That does not happen quickly. So they are just thrilled when somebody reaches out and asks a question about their research or asks for a PDF. So don't hesitate to do that. That's the easiest way to get your hands on an actual journal article. We've talked about some of the compilations and places where you can find research. There are some nice online resources, again, compilation types of research and podcasts. Matt Burns has a unique thing he does on his YouTube channel where he interviews on Zoom researchers who have recent publications, and he goes a little bit deeper into what their work was about. Nina, who is joining us tonight, has an amazing service called the Reading Research Recap, where once a week you can get a nice, concise summary of reading research delivered to your inbox. It's a fantastic service. You can search online. You can do a straight up, Google search. You can go to Google Scholar. That's where sometimes you'll run into that paywall issue, but sometimes you get lucky. When you are a member of a professional association, you receive their publications, and that's a great way to get access to research. If you have any connection to a university, you might have the ability to use the databases in their library. And if you don't have access to a university, maybe you have a friendly neighborhood professor, like somebody nearby, who, if you send them an email or a text, would be happy to search up the PDF and make that available to you. Sometimes the related service folks in your school settings, like SLPs or school psychologists, may have access to those databases, so that might be an option for you as well. Okay, that's it. What questions do you all have? I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see. As you're thinking about your questions, I'll mention that in that handout folder that I shared, there's a PDF of the slides. There is a document that I created to support people to read a journal article. So it's just a little bit of narrative detail about what I shared with you. And then I included the PDF of that study, the Spencer study that I was using as a model to kind of walk you through the parts of an article. So those are the 3 items that you'll see there. Okay, questions?
So I have a question, and just a quick review. I'm still learning these things as I go, but a lot of terms are used almost interchangeably, where it's research-based, evidence-based, all of those. Could you go through those a little bit, just for the sake of anyone who's listening to our recording, to know what that means when they see it on a program, or when they might see it on, like an online clearinghouse or something like that?
Yeah, I'm probably not the best person to respond to that, actually, because I don't pay much attention to those terms.
Okay.
I think somebody can correct me, but I think the way that those are used, research-based is used to describe a practice that is built upon research, but hasn't actually been researched itself. And I think the term evidence-based is used for those practices that have been the subject of empirical research and have been found to actually be effective. So I think that's my understanding. I'm not sure how helpful those uh, distinguishing those terms is, but that's
I
just
think
my
there might be
opinion.
a false sense of security when both of those terms are labeled onto something.
Yeah,
And so,
sure.
always a good method to dig deeper, correct?
Yes, and you all know I'm a big proponent of research. I'm a giant geek who spends her free time reading research articles. Like, I find that to be fun. And even with that said, um, there's no way to know if an approach, a practice, a routine, a strategy is going to work with your students. So you can do all your due diligence, you can span the globe, you can find something that has been shown elsewhere to work with kids just like yours in your circumstance, but there's still no guarantee it's going to work. So I really ascribe to a scientist practitioner approach to education. I think every teacher should be doing little experiments with their students. Like, I think you should be implementing a problem solving model where you're developing a hypothesis about why the student is a struggling reader. And you should be doing diagnostic assessment to uncover, really what's the root cause. And you should be putting a strategy in place to the best of your knowledge that has worked before for other kids who have a similar problem. And you should progress monitor as you're doing it to see if it actually works with this kid. So that's
I love that.
my inclination.
I think that might be something I would love as a follow-up. As someone who is always individually problem solving students, I think that that's a definitely a missing piece of how to do those little mini research things on students who might be struggling. So thanks
Yes.
for that.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. That is my bandwagon I've been on for many years, that teachers need the support of that framework of thinking through, here's this kid in front of me who's struggling. What are the steps? What's the thinking process? How do I think my way through this to get to a good result for this student?
And that system of collaboration around that, where we hit a paywall with the research, where's your instructional wall? And that's our MTSS model, right? That we have a great collaborative teaming and an opportunity to come back around that data and help problem solve around some next steps, so that we
Yes,
don't hit the paywall of instruction.
yes. And it's super powerful when that MTSS is applied at the systems level, so that you're not solving each problem one student at a time, that you're taking a curriculum and instruction perspective and using universal screening data to do that. That's really helpful.
I'd like to double back to something that I appreciated that you lifted, reaching out to the researcher for the PDF, but also don't hesitate to reach out to that researcher for a conversation.
Yes.
Just that they are hungry. I have built some just amazing relationships, and I think that is one of the things that we're not talking about in the translation from the research to the practice, is the authentic relationships.
Yeah.
That our researchers are their teachers.
Yes.
Just we are, in a way. They are problem solving on a larger scale than a micro scale.
Yes.
And they are anxious to share, and they don't get the lens we are. I think that as educators, we put them on a pedestal that they do not want to be on. They want that lens back into the classroom and back into, if you're going to try what I tried at this level, let's talk.
Absolutely.
I think that's so important in our community, that we as chapter leads can really help bridge that relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, because I have a foot in both worlds, and have worked as a university professor in the past as well, that what they're after is improved outcomes for students, just like classroom teachers are. They're just coming at it from a different approach. And they, like I said, are tickled if anybody's interested in the research that they've done. So they really like to talk about it. They need real world experiences. They need input from educators to help inform their work, to help guide their research agenda. They're sometimes looking for places to do research. So those partnerships are really important. And if they can be developed at the local level, that's great. But now with all of the social media opportunities and the distance meeting opportunities, you can reach out to people in other countries to share their research.
And I did just that. A researcher from Britain and the UK, and it was about stuttering and speech and connected to reading, and it was quite an interesting conversation and relationship building. Of course, there were the time frames, but I just want to lift that for every single. Doesn't matter your role. If you're interested in what they wrote, reach out.
Yep. Yes,
So
Mr. Pelk.
So who is writing most of the education research articles? I'm pretty new to all this research reading. Do you think teachers write about their research? Or do you think they, who's
Occasionally.
writing?
Yep. So you will occasionally see those in publications like IDA's Perspectives or The Reading Teacher from ILA. I think that's who publishes The Reading Teacher. You'll sometimes see those kinds of action research projects, teachers who are interested, they have questions about what's happening in their school and they'll conduct research and submit it for publication. I would say by and large, it's university professors. And very, very often when you see multiple names on a title page, those are graduate students. Good university professors are collaborative, and so they may be working even across departments. We wish that happened more, but within their department, collaborating with other faculty to conduct research, and so their names will appear on the title page. But very often, those additional names are graduate students. Either sometimes the first name will be a doctoral student, and the second name will be their advisor at the university. That's often how it goes. There are several multi-site federally funded research institutes. So you'll see, sometimes you'll see people from multiple universities in multiple cities publishing together because they've done research together. So I think the vast majority of journal publications that are research studies are from university professors. And it's a genre of writing, right? Like, we teach kids for different types of text to approach it in different ways. And there is a style of writing, the journal article. So if you start reading some, you'll start to pick up on the similarities of style and the way I showed you the structure, but you'll also pick up on the style of how they're written.
That leads to mind the question that the authors are the university professors. It begs the question, why is that not a requirement in university to teach teachers and practitioners how to read the research? And it's interesting because we all had to write the papers, so we probably weren't even reading them well. And it's interesting that we were expected to summarize and apply, but I was never directly taught until I went into the training that I have for my current position. So I wonder, why is there that gap?
It depends. I think there's probably a great deal of variability in people's experiences and maybe even in the reasons why folks aren't trained. it goes back to something you said earlier, that, you know, in some circles, in some universities, in some training programs, there isn't a value to base your decisions as an educator on research. That is, in some cases, not valued, and in some cases, actually frowned upon and discouraged, actively discouraged. So it really depends on the university and on the program and the individual faculty in those programs. So I think people's experiences are different, but by and large, I don't think we do a good job of training people to be consumers of the research. We don't have that expectation. It is in the knowledge and practice standards, in the IDA standards. It's in there, but we don't tend to do a good job preparing folks for that. And then it's a real gap because people don't feel confident. They feel embarrassed to not know, or not how to know how to access a journal article, or then what to look at when they get it. So, you know, just like we're saying, reach out to the university professors and the authors of the research on these other questions, reaching out for an explanation of the study is perfectly appropriate. I think that's part of what Matt Burns is trying to do on his YouTube channel, trying to like demystify and explain in real people terms what the research was about.
Can I add that just that this is a really good segue for as a bit of a commercial for the Reading League. This summer we are going to be doing a Saturday summer series, so some Saturday mornings in the summer with Nina Saha. So Saturdays with Saha, and we're going to take more work of teaching people how to look at the research articles, and then we're going to apply. So the next step is, so we're getting, there will be a survey that goes out of what they're polling, what interest they would like to study further, and then we're going to read some of those research articles and think about application, implication, and all of the mix thereof. So
that's fantastic. That is a wonderful professional development opportunity. Is that available to people outside of Michigan?
The whole entire state. And I'm going to post this on our chapter, and it'll go the nation. We invite anyone into our activities. So I'm going to post this as opportunities for a watch party, so people can have access to this again and some conversations within. And then this summer, here we go with Nina, and hopefully then to build some access to the reading recap, so that so for me, there's that bridge to the research for the practitioner in a manageable way. It's a start.
Yeah,
it's a start.
That's terrific. Excellent. Well, I'm going to stop the recording unless there's anything else you want to get onto the official record. No? Okay.